Okay, guys, so this is for your Unit C test review. It is in two parts, like I told you before. The first part will cover the CFA. The second part will cover the test. So right around when we're doing uh, fossil fuels, that's the CFA part. So if you just need to redo the CFA, then just look through part one of the fossil fuels. If you need to redo the test, then you need to watch all the way through fossil fuels, alternative energy sources, and the part at the end about sustainable farming. So this will help you. Now remember, if you get to class, you have questions, you can feel free to go ahead and ask me those. So this is part one, and we're concentrating on fossil fuels. The first fossil fuel that we are going to be looking at is coal. Now keep in mind that you mine for coal, okay? It's not drilled for or harvested, you mine for coal, okay? One of the most popular methods of mining is surface mining. Okay, so that's when you're scratching through the surface. Now keep in mind there's surface mining and there's deep pit mining as well, and that's when you go below the surface to find things. Now, the advantages of using coal, it has changed over time, so we're better understanding how to use our coal. It's very reliable source of energy. Now, it does emit CO2 emissions. Remember, CO2 is your carbon dioxide, so you're going to have some issues with that being a source of pollution as far as air pollution, and health to the workers. So when you're thinking about who's mining for that, keep in mind we've seen those movie sets. I think it was like the 13, and we've talked about it in class how it can become dangerous for the miners because the miners are inhaling the dust that they're creating, also drilling all those holes into the earth, the lithosphere to be specific, is causing it to weaken at points. So you can only crack something so much before it's going to collapse. So in mining, that does become an issue for sure. So our next fossil fuel is oil. So keep in mind when we're working with oil that it is a fossil fuel that we use, and we use oil for a lot of things. So not only the crude oil in the barrels that we use for various things, it has to be refined, and we use that for gas in our cars. Oil is also part of making plastics and other materials. So oil is the most used fossil fuel that, or one of the most used fossil fuels that we have in the United States that we work with. So you drill for this, you drill through the sedimentary rock layer. Okay. Now it's only found in your sedimentary rocks. So this and natural gas is what's drilled for. Now, the pros of it is reliable. One of the most used sources that we use in the United States. One of the cons of drilling for oil is you can come up with those oil spills that we've had. Exxon Valdez back in the 80s, and you guys were in middle school when we had the BP oil spill, and the dangers that it has to the environment and the lasting effects. Now, when you're looking at natural gas, the fossil is a fossil fuel, and we just mentioned that you drill for it. Now, when you're drilling for natural gas, you're going to drill just before you get to the oil. So it's found in the sedimentary rock, and it sits right on top of the sedimentary rock. Because remember density, and your liquid is more dense than your gas. So your oil settles at the bottom, and right on top of that is the natural gas. So it's drilled for, but they're also considering hydrofracking. Now, remember we talked about hydro means water, fracking means there's some type of fracture that is happening. So in hydrofracking, that means we're drilling little fractures, or little fractures are being drilled into the earth, and then you're pumping water in. Now, it reduces, the good thing about hydrofracking is it reduces the CO2. Which is that carbon dioxide. Now, the bad thing we mentioned about hydrofracking is you're pumping in all that sand and other chemicals in order to push the natural gas out by using the water. It can contaminate the water supply that we have. So well water is an issue, groundwater. We still use that water. Keep in mind, water is recycled. It's not given brand new water. We're drinking the same water dinosaurs drank, Abraham Lincoln drank, everybody drank, whatever. So being it's a recycling thing, we're recycling that contaminated water, and it will not be properly filtered out before it's actually accessible to people. Now in class we've talked about wood harvesting, and wood harvesting is when the trees are cut down, and that wood is used for things such as building structures, building houses, paper, school supplies, things of that nature. So very common things. Now, with that wood harvesting, you have deforestation. And deforestation is when you cut down the trees and you do not replant that area. Now, when we took our trip to the farm, we were looking at Christmas trees. They had the Christmas tree farm, and that was what they were growing there. That's not deforestation when they cut them down, because they're going to regrow another set of Christmas trees. So that is just more of a selective cutting type scenario. But deforestation is they are not replanting those at all. Now, we talked about in class photosynthesis, and the process of photosynthesis is very simple. So we breathe out carbon dioxide and breathe in oxygen. So when we breathe out that CO2, the plants are going to take that CO2 in. They have this purification system. Mainly there's a system to help them survive. So that's photosynthesis, creating their energy from the sun's rays and processing through that CO2, and they're going to emit oxygen out to us. So we're going to breathe in that oxygen and give them back the CO2, and it is this constant recycling. Now, when you have deforestation, you have a raise in the CO2 levels, because now what's filtering through that CO2? Nothing. We've cut down the trees and we can't, they're not able to filter through that carbon dioxide. And it's going to have a rise in CO2 levels and a decline in oxygen levels, okay, because they're not producing that out for us. So that's one, well, technically two things, I guess you say. They cannot perform photosynthesis, and we cannot get the cleaner version of oxygen that we need. So that's a problem with deforestation and wood harvesting. The other problem comes into when you pick up those trees, or when those trees are lifted out of the ground, you have all this loose soil. So what are you going to do with all that loose soil? It's eventually going to erode away, okay? There's nothing there to anchor it. It's just there. So keep that in mind with it as well. Also, habitat destruction. So the habitats of these animals are being taken away from them. So that's now why we see deer in some neighborhoods. Seems a little random to have deer running around the neighborhood. Well, they don't have any room. They don't have any place to go. Most likely where they are is where their habitat was at the time. So wood harvesting has some pros, as it gives us the products we need, but it definitely has some cons as well. So keep in mind your fission and your fusion plants. So your fission plants, your fission is happening. Fission means division, and we've talked about that in class. Remember those double S's. So that's when you have, for example, your uranium and your plutonium, and they're like an Alka-Seltzer tablet. They're just going to divide on their own. Now, fusion is when they fuse together. So think about like a hydrogen bomb, or where places on the sun are. So that is what nuclear energy is. That's how we get it. Now, nuclear energy has to be stored. The waste, sorry. So this is a con. So the waste from nuclear energy has to be stored, and it has to be monitored for at least 10,000 years after the waste is stored. So there's some pros and some cons. So we do have our nuclear energy plant. We get less pollution from our nuclear energy plant, but then again, you're going to have to monitor that waste for years to come. Okay, and I just realized I put less in, so please excuse that. Okay, so now we've entered part 2. So we've just ended our CFA portion. Now we're looking at alternative energies. Alternative energies are those energies that we use using more natural type means of what we have on Earth. However, alternative energy does have some cons, because there's limitations in what you can use the energy for, or when you can use the energy. So for example, solar energy, and solar energy comes from the sun. However, solar energy, we have talked about, mainly works when the sun is shining. And if the sun's not shining, it really is not reliable. Now, there is no definitive way yet. They're still making progressive ways to store the solar energy. So that is still happening. But since it's not a concrete way to store it right now, then they're going to say solar energy is only really reliable when the sun is shining, and that's absolutely correct. So when you see that in your books on your tests, go ahead and remember it that way. Um, Mountains is a good place where this is going to be found, those solar panels, because we've talked about the elevation and the fact that you were closer to the sun at that point, the altitude wise. So it's a very reliable place to have it in your mountainous areas of North Carolina and in other places. Now, geothermal is heat from the Earth's interior. So what is found inside the Earth? You're most likely not going to get geothermal energy from North Carolina as a reliable alternative energy source. It helps to be near the plate boundary, though, with the geothermal energy, so that way when you're trying to drill, it just helps already that there's a fracture in the earth that you can go to, and it fits. So you have wind energy. We've talked about that in class as well as an alternative energy. So with your wind energy, you're using the power of the wind to generate energy. Okay, so it's turning the turbine, processing the generator, flowing through that way. Places where you want to use this is your flatter areas. This is definitely somewhere desert. Also, the beaches give that nice breeze, so they can be used in that area for as an energy source. Remember, you can use multiple energies at the same time. When I told you about when I went to Texas, I saw them using the fossil fuel, the drilling, but then they had a lot of wind turbines as well because Texas is flat and there's going to be normally enough wind for it to power through. So you definitely want them high up. You want them higher where the wind is to get that going. A steady, sustainable gust of wind would be helpful. We talked about some of the cons of this energy is that the birds do kind of fly their path into them. It's not enough to disrupt the entire food chain, but it is something definitely to think about. Now, with your hydroelectricity, hydro means water, electricity, running water. So this is where we get electricity generated through the process of running water. So you have to be in a space where the size of the body of water is enough to produce this energy. You can't have it on a basic lake. It has to be somewhere where you really got some flowing water and a good amount of that water. So you build a dam in part of the river, and that helps block. And you have like a reserve to where you can get the water if there's a drought, if there's a shortage. Now, with this, when you block off part of the dam or you block off part of the river with a dam, you do have a con here, and you are separating the part of the environment from the other part of the environment. So now an environment that used to be free flowing up and down the space, when you cut it off, now has to reorganize itself in order to adapt. So it habitat disruption. Now, a benefit is water is free. I know you're paying $3 for that Dasani water, but for the most part, water is a free resource. So it's a low cost, energy efficient resource that we're using. So when we took our field trip to the farm, one of the things we looked at was how they're making the farm more sustainable and the different techniques now that they are using that weren't used back then. So sustainability, a large chunk of sustainability is looking at the environment as something that we want to improve the quality of. So specifically looking at the fact we want to improve the soil quality for sustainable farming. And one of the ways to improve that is through crop rotation. So we talked about in class that monoculture is the growing of one thing, and that's traditional farming. That farmer grows one thing. So in traditional farming, the farmer grows one thing. They use pesticides, and there was a couple other things we talked about. Sustainable farming, they are not using those pesticides. They're not doing anything unnaturally healthy to the soil or to the animals, or unnecessary, sorry, to the soil and to the animals. So one of the things you want to look at is monoculture. Mono means one. So in traditional farming, they grow one thing. That's all you get. Okay. in crop rotation, they will rotate the crop. So you know what? They may grow corn, and then the next year it may be carrots. And I'm making this up because I do not, I mean, as far as like what they grow each year, I'm not sure. But it can be something to rotate to make the soil healthier. So it could be corn. I'm not sure. We're just giving an example at this point. But something rotates to where they're not growing corn every year. It's something different. So that helps improve the soil quality because, for one, the soil's nutrients is not taken out for that very specific thing the whole time, to which it's, I don't want to say, I want probably degraded. Okay, it's corn needs this specific part in the soil more than another part. If this part gets a little confusing, just let me know and I'll be more than happy to explain it in class. But definitely just looking at what's the difference between sustainable farming and traditional farming, know those. So that concludes your recap for the test. Remember, you are responsible for watching this video and the CFA, so keep in mind you are responsible for watching this video before you take your CFA and before you take your retest. Okay? All right, well, that is it. I'm going to leave you a word to make sure that you remember to watch this video, and it's going to be chicken liver. So if you remember chicken liver, I know that you watched the video like you're supposed to.